So good morning, welcome to the first eMemoir webinar of 2020. This morning we're looking at an update on the funding of 16 to 19 study programmes for 2020 to 2021. As ever, we like to keep our webinars as interactive as possible, so feel free to use the question or chat facility at any point throughout the duration of this webinar. If you're watching this on a video recording and you have any questions or thoughts, then our contact details will be available on the final slide, and I'd encourage you to get in touch with us and we'll be more than happy to help. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Beej. Keep the questions coming all.
Thanks very much, then, Manik. Good morning to everyone and Happy New Year to everyone. As Manik says, this is the first of the webinars that we'll be doing in 2020. For those of you who are subscribers or regular customers, we'll be repeating this morning the webinar that I did in December on an update on the funding of 16 to 19 study programs for 2020 to 21. For those of you obviously are not subscribers or regular customers, then this is the first of our new offer, and hopefully as a result of today you'll be interested in taking up our subscription and our membership to our webinar service. Again, making a few assumptions, we'll be looking at the funding of a 16 to 19 study program. So I'm assuming that most of you listening in are in the post-16 sector, colleges. We've got some independent training providers that I know of, some local authorities, and we've also got a couple of academies. This funding formula, which of course is not changing, so that's the one thing that's not staying, it's not changing. Its basic methodology is staying the same, and similarly the 16 to 19 allocation mechanism is staying very much the same for 2020-21. So those of you who are FE colleges, you'll be receiving in the course of this month guidance to support your funding allocation, and you'll also be getting the first issue of the calculation toolkit, which contains all the funding factors that relate to your individual institution. Those of you who are independent learning providers and academies, you'll be getting those from February onwards. So with that sort of in mind, and there's some good news for a change, which is very important. Let's have a look at the sort of headlines for 2020 to 21. As I said, and I wrote a recent blog on this, good news. There's been a total investment of just around £400 million for the next year, 2020 to 21. And that, I think, is after many years of only having small levels of investment in post-16 funding in the FE and skills sector in England. Now, I'm going to show how that's being allocated across the different funding heads. But basically, as I said in my introduction, the funding methodology is being retained. And obviously, we're awaiting other news. That's the news about what's going to happen to adult education in future. Obviously, we've got the future of apprenticeships, and these will be in future webinars. I think the first headline is that just under half of the £400 million is being invested in something that we have been looking for the last 7, 8, 9 years, and that is an increase in the base rate of funding for 16 to 19-year-olds. And that's going to take up £190 million. So for those of you, particularly with large numbers of 16 and 17-year-olds, your first year in post-16, that's going to make a significant difference of about 4.7% in the base rate of funding. Now, whether that's enough or not, well, we'll consider in the course of this webinar, and certainly I've got some thoughts on it. But that's the first bit of good news, is that the basic rate of funding is going up from the 4,000 that you currently get as the base rate for a 16, 17-year-old who's doing a full-time program of at least 540 hours in a year. And that will be going up to 4,188. All the part-time rates will also go up, and I'll look at that in a little bit more detail. Now, the second big chunk of this extra investment is actually addressing a major issue that has faced the sector since the funding methodology was introduced, and that's very much about what is the rate of funding that you get for the more expensive programs that you run. These are the high-cost programs which for the same hour costing maybe 20-30% more than, for example, an hour of delivering an arts program, a humanity program, an A-level program, other than in the sciences. But the second element of it is the high value premium, which I want to look at, because that's quite an important departure in the funding formula, this idea of introducing a premium for those learners who are doing what we call high value subjects. And, that's includes things like engineering, manufacturing, some of the catering operations, some of the transport operations, and some construction. But I think that's an important departure that needs to be looked at. Something that's important for all of us, if you're not involved in T-levels at the moment, is that, for example, within T-levels, there's additional funding for maths and English for learners that haven't yet achieved the level 2 or the GCSE grade 4 to 9. Now, that's going to be extended to other study programs, but only at level 3. So I think that I'll be looking at, as well as obviously the things that you can assume will always be part of the formula. The English and maths condition will continue with the current funding tolerance levels. The funding for T levels I'll look at briefly. There is some additional funding for T levels, particularly for early adopters of the new T levels. And I think also a recognition that in our sector, the retention of good quality teachers and leaders has been an issue. So there are some elements of funding for that. So that's if you want, the big headlines that I'll be focusing on in the next 45 to 50 minutes with you. Now, let's start by making a couple of important information interventions here, because although a lot of this looks like new investment, is actually the continuation of investment that's already been in place. So, for example, if you're involved in developing and improving the quality and range of industry placements for your students, the capacity development funds will continue for another year. That will be available to those of you who are already drawing down that funding to assist with the implementation of T-levels and other longer programs. But that will also involve the opportunity for those of you who have maybe not used that fund in the past to be able to do so, to invest in delivering industry placements for your 16 to 19 students. As I said, some things will continue. The advanced maths premium funding of £600 for each additional student taking a specified level 3 maths qualification. A-levels for the maths and A-levels, A-level maths, core maths, etc. That's going to continue for another year into 2020-21. So that's obviously a change that was introduced in the past that will be funded for another year. As I said, what is new will be the level 3 program maths and English payment. So supports those of you who are delivering English and maths resits, particularly those students on substantial level 3 programs. That's already been introduced into T levels, but be expanded now to other substantial level 3 study programs. And also that we have now got information that the T level early adopter development fund, which pays £30,000 one-off for each T level that you intend to introduce. Now that was introduced for those of you who are intending to introduce them in 2020-21. Then that's going to be extended now for those of you who are intending to deliver T levels in 2021-22. So, as I said, some continuation of projects or of investment funds into the next year, and in some cases, obviously, that will hopefully go beyond. So in terms of the formula for those young people on study programs, not including T levels, then we know that the existing formula looks like this. So it's still driven very much by student numbers and the lag number effect, the rates of funding, depending on which band your cohorts are in, the retention factor, which still applies to core learning aim, and you lose 50% of the funding if the learner is not retained in the core learning aim. The program cost weightings I'll look at. That's because they're going to change. Disadvantage funding will stay very much the same as it has in the past, particularly Block 2, and the large program uplift will stay very much the same. Now, they're all subject to the area cost allowance, so they give you that formula funding which takes account of the location of the delivery of your learning, particularly if you're delivering to 16 to 19 students in London in the southeast. In in the additional funding elements are obviously not subject to the area cost allowance. So what's going to be very important, and you'll find out when you see the allocation calculation toolkit, which comes out this month, is whether some of the new elements will be part of the formula in terms of figure 1, therefore have the area cost allowance applied to them, which of course could give you an uplift of an extra 10 to 20% in some cases if you're a central London provider, or will they be outside of that and be an additional funding element that's not subject to area cost allowance. So that includes things like the care standards funding. Formula protection, by the way, this is the last year of its application, so that won't be applied after 2020-21. High needs, which is a separate webinar which we're doing soon. You've got your discretionary learner support funding, the industry placements funding, which is the CDF, which will continue for those of you already getting it and for new entrants, and obviously the advanced maths premium for all those additional learners that are studying maths relative to your base year at level 3, which of course is that extra £600 you're getting per learner. Now those elements are outside of what then has the area cost allowance applied to it. These new elements will be added. My thinking is that the what do you call it, the level 3 maths will be part of the formula, whereas maybe the premium for high value courses might be outside, very similar to the advanced maths premium, which is not subject to the area cost allowance. But we'll wait and see. So for the majority of us, the study program bands will look like this next year. You can see that the full-time rate for 16, 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds who have got high needs, and that's, by the way, extended to those who are 19 to 25 with an education healthcare plan. Those funding rates have gone up by 4.7% to 4188, and that's what you should start to model. And you will do this, obviously, I'm sure, with your modelling software, what next year's allocation should look like. And then all the part-time rates have been pro-rata to take account of that. So that's the first important change, to recognise that there's a 4.7% increase in the base rate for all your learners, whatever band they're in. And that obviously then has to be factored into your sums for next year in terms of working out what would be the impact of the lag number effect and what's going to be like your likely allocation, take account of those funding factors. It might also have implications for the determination of, at departmental level, as what the revenue will be for that department relative to its cost. And that's going to be very important when we start looking at the changes to the program cost weightings. So those are the sort of what I'd call the key issues there that you're looking at without T levels. Now, when it comes to the T levels, some of these changes will actually also impact on T levels for next year. And I know that from those of you listening in, some of you are introducing T levels next year. We know that the T level funding formula is very similar to that for the rest of the study programs, except we have 4 new bands, and they obviously reflect the longer hours that's going to be expected over 2 years. We know that there are extra payments outside the what I'd call the formula for each industry placement, which is £275 per year. Remember, inside a study program, your work experience is not subject to an additional payment, whereas with a T level it is. And we know that the other difference between T levels and the rest of study programs is that on a T level, the funding stays the same for an 18-year-old as it does for a 16, 17-year-old, because it reflects the fixed number of hours required to achieve the threshold competence to complete your T level. Whereas in the study programs, 18-year-olds would normally be on a lower rate of funding, even if they had programs of more than 540 hours. The other thing to note is that already in the T level was the additional funding, which is the £750 per qualification. That's for English, and separately £750 for maths if the minimum requirement for English and maths are not met, i.e. the learner hasn't yet achieved the grade 4 to 9 GCSE. The other thing to note about T levels is that the Block 2 disadvantage funding, which takes account of prior attainment in English and maths, it's a proxy for low-cost additional learning support for T-level students, is £650 per incident. That's that's 650 if they haven't achieved maths, and 650 haven't achieved English. And that's part of your Block 2 disadvantage funding, not to be confused with the additional £750 for not having yet achieved your level 2 English and maths on your T-level program. Now that's partly to reflect the longer program and the longer cost of the hours, as well as the longer placement, which is going to be obviously much bigger than it is on other study programs. And that is something, and that is different because on Block 2 funding, disadvantage funding for other study programs in the 2020-21 methodology will still remain at £480 per subject. So there's going to be that difference. And of course, there's the one-off payments for early adopters of T-levels of £30,000 per T-level. And of course, the £20,000 if you're an early adopter of the level 2 transition framework. So that's different. But when you look at the formula, you'll see that in the formula, the area cost allowance is applied to exactly the same factors as it was for T-levels, plus the addition of the English and maths funding. That £750 for each incidence is actually part of the formula, whereas the other elements are outside the formula, very similar to what we've got with the other study programs. So a couple of questions are coming through. There's £550 per industry placement per learner is per learner that's doing a T-level. So Jennifer, if you've got a learner or whichever T-level they're doing, it doesn't matter which pathway they're doing, there is that additional £550 per T-level that they're doing. In other words, that individual learner. And that's obviously spread over 2 years. So that's split in half at £275. Remember that T-level industry placement here does not apply to any learner that's not doing a T-level. So again, this is different from what is available for those learners on other study programs. So I mean, the confusion I think we might have is that when we talk about study programs do include T-levels. It's a type of study program, but it has those unique characteristics, which of course are not the same in what do you call it, other study programs. So when you look at the industry placement funding, that is quite separate from the formula, as opposed to a study program, which is not a T-level, where your use of hours and the way you use up the 540 or 600 hours to include a work experience or an industry placement is actually funded in that funding rate, not that separate allocation which you get here. Or that separate element that you'll get in your allocation. And the other thing to note, by the way, is although we still have a potential reduction in funding if you don't meet the condition of funding, i.e. you're outside the tolerance level for the total value of students who should have been doing English and maths resits who haven't, or doing English and maths as part of the study program, that doesn't apply to T-levels. So that's quite an interesting factor to note as well. So as I said, these new elements will be also added because T-levels will be subject to the change in program cost weightings, and also there will be the new element known as the high value premium, the high value cost premium, which I think my reading would be that would be outside of the formula bit, i.e. this bit, and more likely to be alongside the advanced maths premium. Let's wait and see. Okay, so those are the and those are the T-level bands that will be introduced. So those of you who are introducing T-levels next year, these are now the rates that you'll be using, not the rates that were obviously around when you were first consulted on the future of T-level. Most of the T-levels will be around, I think, band 7, possibly some at band 8. I can't see many in band 9. And don't forget, these would be requiring the average planned hours there, and these would be the minimum planned hours. So these are the sort of thresholds, and you're talking about a minimum there of 825 hours a year, and that would give you that funding rate. But don't forget, these funding rates are for 2 years, so not, so again, substantially higher than what you're getting for other study programs by comparison. Now, so that's the first big change. The rates actually changing. The second big change is the changes to program cost weightings, and the implications of this for planning and delivery of your study programs I'll pick up in a few minutes. But this is quite a significant set of changes, which I think reflects a frustration we've had certainly since the introduction of the formula, is that that there's a lot of evidence to show that some subjects are just not being weighted at the right level, and therefore the higher cost of delivery per hour hasn't been reflected in the weightings. And this has been particularly an issue for STEM subjects and things like manufacturing, construction, engineering, etc. So yeah, the planned hours, by the way, do include the placement hours within those bands. Yeah, so you could expect that to be the case. Yep. And how you make up those hours, well that's a separate set of issues, and I'll pick those up with you at an update on T-level funding. Thanks for that question. Coming back to program cost weightings, and by the way, the changes to program cost weightings also apply to T-levels. So any of those T-levels that will be within those sector subject areas will see an increase. And what they're saying is that those subjects per hour, because of the higher cost of staffing, the higher cost of resourcing, needed a different program cost weighting. So for 6 sector subject areas, whatever their individual weightings are this year, the year 18-19, they will now go up. Sorry, 18-19. I mean, obviously that was the last outturn year. Whatever your distribution of subjects of programs was across the sector subject areas, those ones will all go up by 10 percentage points. So they could go up from 1.1 to 1.2, 1.2 to 1.3, 1.3 to 1.4. There will be 2 new program weightings. Low will be introduced, which allows things to go up from 1 to 1.1, and very high, which allows things to go up from 1.3 to 1.4. Transportation operations, maintenance, and building and construction, hospitality catering, they'll go up from medium, which was the existing 1.2. They'll now go up to this new category of high at 1.3. Engineering and manufacturing technologies, they will increase from high, which was 1.3, to very high at 1.4. So you can see that those are 10 percentage points. So from 1.2 to 1.3, 1.3 to 1.4. What will also be different is that there'll be a new factor called low, which is the one that's gone up from 1 to 1.1. And that will apply to any study program with a vocational core aim in science. So if you're doing things like a BTEC level 3 in science, or a study program consisting of 2 or more science A-levels. So that's A-levels, obviously linear A-levels, or the A-levels done over 2 years. So as long as there are 2, at least 2 in whatever the program that individual learner has. So that means that those increases will mean take account of the fact that and those are the 6 sector subject sector areas, from science right through to hospitality catering. What it reflects is what we've always said, was that it was very difficult sometimes if you were the manager of one of those programs and you were trying to break even or meet your expected contribution to college or institutional overheads, you were always struggling. So for example, if you didn't have at least 14 or 15 students, but only had 12 or 13, it'd be very difficult for you to meet the full cost of delivery. Now, this is partly reflecting it, and that's one of the first things I think that many providers will be doing, is they will be modeling what those increases in program cost weightings mean to those departments that I've just described, from science right through to hospitality catering, and saying that, for example, if we do recruit 14 learners and they're retained to the end of each year, what would be the implications for the amount of funding that subject will generate in terms of the ability for it now to meet 100% of its costs, or to make sure it is at least contributing as much to the running cost of the college in terms of overheads as other subject areas. So I think that's a very important change that has implications for departmental budgets and the way in which you allocate your allocation to different areas. And I think, again, modeling software, whatever you're using, can do that for you. So these would be the new program cost weightings. So as I said, most A levels will still appear at base rate 1. Science A levels, as long as the learner is doing at least 2. And the data that will be this will be based on will be the outturn data for 2018-19. So what went into your R14 return will be the basis for this. So you can see that there's that new category of very high for engineering, manufacturing, hospitality, building and construction have gone up. And obviously that's got to be reflected in your new allocation. And that will be one of the changes within the funding factors that will have an impact on you. So you've got an increase in the base rate, you've also got an increase in program cost weightings. And when you put those two together, you start to get some indication of what the viability of individual programs will be and individual departments will be. Now, so that's the second big change. The third big change, I think, has got all kinds of implications, particularly in terms of what might be the behaviour of you as providers. And certainly, you know, I'm a governor of a medium-sized college, but also director of 2 independent training companies, and we're conscious that a lot of our delivery is not in these what we call high-value course premium areas, and therefore we won't be seeing the benefit of some of these things. This is very much part of the industrial strategy to move more and more of our 16 to 19 learners into those subject areas which are going to generate the highest productivity levels, the highest economic growth, that are going to support basically the industrial strategy of the UK. So this is particularly those level 3 study programs, and this includes, by the way, not just A levels, but vocational programs in the sector subject areas, and this also extends to T levels. So this will have an impact on T levels as well. So it's not just about, you know, my study program; it's my study program including T levels that will be impacted on. Now this is going to be a premium. And therefore, I think of it as being outside of the formula that has the area cost uplift applied to it, because that would then give you a benefit within that area just because of your location, similar to what happens with the maths premium. This is going to be paid at £400 per student per year that the student is on their study program or a T level. So again, over 2 years, this could generate an extra £800 per learner, as long as they're on a level 3 program. So there are no premiums here for level 2 learners, which is obviously something that's an issue, and I'll pick that up. But they've got to be on selected A levels, for example, and they've got to be doing at least 2 of them, or a vocational program of at least 360 hours per year off that list of qualifying subjects. Now, when it says provider behaviour will be monitored closely, now the expectation is this will mean that there is a premium on attracting more learners into those sector subjects, such as engineering, science, etc. But the provider behaviour is going to be monitored for other reasons, like, you know, is this going to be disproportionate to your other learners? Is it possible that some behaviours will creep in which mean that you direct learners away from other subjects to these subjects? We'll wait and see. But it's one of my concerns is that there's some unintended consequences of these changes. So what subjects will benefit from this extra £400 a year per learner? These are the A levels, and notice it includes maths, further maths. So that's additional funding for English for those A levels. Remember, they've got to be doing at least 2 of them. So if they're doing, you know, chemistry and physics, biology and physics, physics and maths, that will attract the premium. Or if they're doing a vocational program, and as long as they're at level 3 of at least 360 guided learning hours a year in these fields of engineering, manufacturing, transport, building, ICT for practitioners. So you can start to see that T levels are also benefiting as part of this premium. Again, that would be based on data as to who the distribution of programs and subjects that were being done by your learners 2018-19. I'll come back to the data collection aspect of this. So those 3 changes, I think, already create a very different total allocation for you, but also within your allocation, quite a different distribution now of revenue to different departments and different subject areas. And you'll notice that, you know, engineering has been mentioned, construction's been mentioned, science has been mentioned. So all the way through, you can start to see impacts of this. Now, the other thing that's quite significant is this level 3 program Maths and English payment. Now, this is additional funding. So this is not part of what you already get within the study program for, for learners who are going to be doing resets in these critical subjects of English and Maths. So if you've got a learner that's studying English and Maths over 2 years, and have to resit it to get up to grade 4 to 9, then that's £750 that you'll draw down over the 2 years. Or if they're only doing it in 1 year, it's £375. But notice, like the T levels, it only applies to level 3 learners. So it's not applied to those learners on programs that are not at level 3. And that could be, of course, the majority of your 16 to 19 cohort. Now, for those learners to be eligible, they must be on a program of at least 2 qualifying A-levels or enrolled on a study program including at least 1 level 3 qualification with a guided learning hours of at least 360 hours or more in a year, or a T level. So this is very similar to what was already introduced for T levels. But remember, this is in addition to what's actually already within the base rate for that learner. So these learners will obviously, this is to pay for the cost of resitting their exams. It isn't the same as Block 2 Disadvantage, which is a different, which is used for usually for low cost learning support. But I think it's important to recognize that again is focusing on level 3. Now, if you're seeing a tone here, if you're seeing a sort of general direction, a lot of the extra investment is going into level 3 learners, which of course is critical for progression. It's critical for progression to HE. It's critical for going into advanced and higher apprenticeships. My still major concern in this is what does this mean if the majority of our learners are level 1 and 2 and all they're getting is this increase in their base rate? So I think it's an important set of things to bear in mind, the implications of this for your internal structures and your internal decisions about how you're going to manage study programs next year and beyond. I think, Laura, the answer to the question is that this is all going to be based on lag numbers very much. So this will be based on data that's already been done and collected for your R14 outturn data for 2018-19. So obviously in future, it might change the way in which you organize your programs, but very much the first payments in the first year will be very much applied to whoever were level 3 learners that you had in 18-19 outturn data. Okay? And then after that, yeah, so that's great. Thanks for that. So again, this is another aspect of the new approach to funding, which takes account of who the learners were historically. And obviously in future, this is going to be, obviously, it's based on your lag numbers. So whether it's enough to pay to support your existing cohort, that will only be reflected in future years as your lag number effect still impacts on this. So, and don't forget, these learners will have an English or Maths aim on their ILR because they've still got to meet the condition of funding. So that's part and parcel of it. Now, for those of you offering students very large programs, baccalaureate, 4 and 5 A-level learners, you'll continue to get a large program uplift. Again, this will be increased. It will be in the 2020 to 21 allocation, but it will reflect the new national funding rate. So when they say we increase it by 10%, be 10% of the new rates or 20% of the new rates. But the data, of course, will be the matched data that we've used in the past from the awarding bodies. Because remember, to meet to get the large program uplift to get 10%, if they're doing 4 A levels, they would have to achieve the 4 A levels at a minimum grade of B, and if it's 5 A levels, a minimum grade of B as well. As I said, the English and Maths condition of funding penalty, which of course still applies, will of course use the old rates for 18-19, not the new rates, but obviously it will then start to take account when you calculate how well you met the condition in future years. So again, that's still part of the allocation. Disadvantage block 2, for those of you not doing T levels, this will apply to the learners not doing T levels. Remember, you've got an allocation now that will have some learners in it who are non-T level learners and other learners who are T level learners, and obviously this block 2 funding for those who are not doing T levels will remain at £480 per incidence, and similarly that's for English and Maths. This is your low cost learning support. Block 2 funding. The disadvantage funding on Block 1 will still use the index of multiple deprivation and be based on postal codes, but care leavers will stay at £480, and those of you with 14 to 16-year-olds then will continue to use the same rates that we apply to 16 to 19-year-olds. So they'll also go up if you've got a 14 to 16 cohort, and that's got a different basis for being calculated. So a lot of the elements are not going to change. Now, what does this mean? I think in implications, it starts to raise quite a lot of issues about the conditions of funding, because essentially to maximize your 16 to 19 funding allocation or contract, if you're not a college or an academy or a school, you have to realize that to satisfy and make those conditions is absolutely critical. So the eligibility of learners and programs will still continue. Now, particularly if you want to draw down some of the additional payments, for example, the level 3 Maths and English payment, or the T level, because they're all at level 3, and the learners have got to be obviously eligible learners in the 16 to 19 or 18 to 25 if they've got education healthcare. 19 to 25 got education and healthcare plans. The English and Maths condition's still there, so that's not going to be diminished other than for your T-level learners. For a lot of your learners, to draw down the additional funding, for example, the high cost, the high value high value courses premium, they've got to be level 3 programs. To draw down the additional funding for English and Math, they've got to be on level 3 programs. The disadvantage funding will still be those 2 blocks, one based on postal code, one based on prior attainment in English and Maths. As I said, the large program uplift you'll only get if you meet a condition for A levels at B, 5 A levels at B to get the 20% one. And of course, underpinning all this is still your performance, which is you must retain the learner on the core learning aim. If that's a T level, they have to be retained on that. If it's A levels, it's got to be one of their A levels that counts for retention. If it's a traineeship, for example, they've got to be retained on the work experience to be able to gain the 100% of the funding. Even though you might get 100% of funding, don't forget if they don't achieve, there'll be quality indicators. And underpinning all of this is still the requirements to meet all of what's required in terms of planned hours, proof of hours, evidence of attendance, etc., for audit requirements, as well as for your qualification achievement rates. So in terms of where the data and what the sources of data, because you've already raised a couple of questions about this, don't forget you're still using your Arrow 4 data that you submitted in December of last year for the lag number effect. Now, of course, that can also reflect that you might have had a different pattern of retention achievement over the course of the year and different participation levels. So we do factor in your Arrow 6 data as well. That's used for lag student numbers. So that's going to be important in determining how many learners are coming into the equation. And some of you will still be catch up because your lag numbers are showing a decline, and therefore you would have had a fall in your allocation. One of the issues will be, will these additional sources of funding more than compensate for any fall? And this is also used for the advanced maths premium with the reference date of the 1st of November. You compare that to a baseline year, and that will tell us from the average of 2 baseline years how many more learners you will have got that can draw down the additional maths premium of £600 per learner. For the large program uplift, we always use the young persons matched administrative data, and we'll be using 2017 to 18 data from the awarding bodies. Local authority data for your high needs element 2 place funding. For those of your FE institutions and individual independent learning providers. And I'll be doing a webinar on this before the end of the month. But then for most of the elements, we're going to be using your ILR R14 data, which is the outturn data for 18-19 for your program size. That will show the distribution between full-time, part-time. Funding factors, retention per subject area, averaged out over the course of the whole of your program, weighted by the number of learners in each one of those areas. Your program cost weightings will now be based on what was the distribution of learners at different programs, now factoring in the additional 10%. The 10% changes. Disadvantage blocks 1 and 2 will reflect that. The high value cost premium will be based on your ILR data. Level 3 English and Maths will be based on your ILR data. So that's in response to the question that was posed before. We know that's also used to apply the condition of funding, and also used to determine how many of your learners would have been drawing down the industry placement funding that is there to promote and deliver the longer placements that you're going to be implementing in future. Now, T-levels, of course, is a combination of some of this data, but also your plans, because this will be your first year of delivering T-levels for some of you, and some of you will be the next year. And then obviously you're going to have to reflect how well you've planned, and that will be done in terms of any tolerance that's applied to your plans, as well as obviously any historical data that we can pull in through the other factors. So those are the sources of data. I still go back to the audit of planned hours, because all of this is still critical for determining whether you maximize your allocation, you deliver the whole of your allocation, whether you have any issues with audit. And by the way, recent financial assurance visits to providers still show that there's still issues around incorrect recording on the ILR of the planned learning hours and the planned employment, enrichment and pastoral hours, the EEP hours. Still a common data error that we've noticed, as well as split courses, as well as issues about what the core learning aim is for some learners. So I think that those planned hours that you're delivering for your study programs and your T-levels will have to meet all of these conditions for them to satisfy audit. Remember, it's planned hours, and that can include, of course, activity which isn't necessarily linked to a learning aim. So with all of those hours with all of this in mind, what are the sort of general conclusions and what we can draw about implications of these changes to funding? Well, I think if you look at the changes for 2021 and you start looking at, well, how does this impact on the cost effectiveness of study programs in total, and then breaking it down by different programs, by different departments or different program areas, then all of these factors are bearing down on it. You've got the cuts in real terms funding, even though we've had an increase in money terms. Is it enough to compensate for real terms? There's a continuing requirement to meet the English and Maths condition. Relevance to the labour market is critical when you start to see the way that the high value courses premium is going to apply, because what's happening in the labour market nationally, how's that reflected regionally and locally? And where do your 16 to 19 learners go? Do they stay in the local labour market, the regional labour market, or the national labour market, especially if they're going into higher education first? I think what this is also driving is the need for us to look at more innovative ways of delivering study programs. For example, a lot of the thinking that's going into T-levels and how to deliver T-levels can have spillover effects in terms of innovative approaches. Look at the way that T-levels, for example, traineeships have sparked innovation. Unfortunately, mostly outside of the college sector, because some of the most innovative approaches have been in the independent training provider sector. And all of this at the same time as we have a focus on the new inspection framework, on the quality of curriculum, and the right focus away from just outcomes, although the outcomes are still important in terms of impact, on what your intention is and your implementation of curriculum is, as it is now, day-to-day experience that learners have of study programs, including T-levels, is going to be critical. So sequencing of learning, stretch and challenge, all of the stuff that comes up in deep dives is going to be critical, including, for example, how well your study program learners retain knowledge, skills, and such like, and can apply them in new situations. So all of this is starting to come together around the effectiveness of study programs and how effective they are, not only in meeting financial targets, cost efficiency, minimum contribution rates, but also are they delivering all that value added, that distance traveled, that significant high quality of learning that is going to be expected in the new inspection framework. So to conclude, and some of these have already been picked up by you, thank you very much, in the sort of questions that you've posed, is are the increases in funding in the base rate and in the cost weightings actually enough to reflect the increases in the real cost of delivery of some aspects of study programs, including T-levels? And the answer is, I don't know until I start to model the whole of I have some indications that, for example, our average cost per hour of putting a teacher in front of a class is no longer £50, it's closer to £55. And that's just the direct cost. That's without the overhead contribution. So if that's gone up by 10% from our last, and we've increased from our last review, and in the same time the increase in the base rate's only gone up by 4.7%, we've still got a lag. So to reflect that, we might have needed at least 4,400 as the rate, possibly even higher than that when you reflect some of the other costs that are not labor costs. The second issue is, and I think this is one of the unforeseen consequences. What could be the consequence of increasing the rates of funding for high cost and high value programs, such as engineering and sciences, over things like humanities and arts? Could this have an implication for the way that you direct or guide students? Could this have an implication on what you offer in the first place? We'll offer lots of science, lots of engineering, and there's less there for learners that don't want to do it. What could this mean to the breadth of programs? Maybe we should focus more on becoming a vocational technical, focusing on engineering, construction, and drop some of the other areas. What does this mean when the individual wants to choose something which is not a high value, high cost program because that's what they want to do? What are the implications for equality and diversity if, for example, in your institution, the majority of learners on construction and engineering and manufacturing courses are young men as opposed to young women? There are a whole lot of questions, I think, that need to be raised and discussed, and were they intended or not? I think that, and one of you has already raised that issue, this seems to favour those subjects done by certain types of learners within your institution. Yeah. And opposed to others. And could this mean that there will be less choice if we don't offer those other programs which don't have those added values now in terms of costs? Will your T-level program, that's another question, but I think I raise it at this point because some of these things will change the revenue now from T-level programs compared to other programs, and will they be able to generate in the first instance reasonable contribution rates? I've noticed in our case that we're, instead of sort of aiming for 20, we're now only aiming for about 12 starters in the first year on our T-level. Well, immediately that raises issues about, will that be viable, and how long can we sustain it using, even if we're using the early adopters fund to help with some of those startup costs. For me, I think by far the biggest issue is, and that's because the majority of learners in my institutions, actually, if you look at the single biggest cohort, they're level 2s, not level 3s. And so we have big issues there about, well, they've been, all right, they get an increase in their base rates, but we can't apply the level 3 maths funding to them. The high value courses can't be applied to them. They're not T-levels. And yet they're the largest cohort in our institution from which we get most of our level 3 in terms of progression rates. So I think there's a lot of issues. And I know that the T-level transition framework at level 2 is also something that needs to be considered. But for me, that means that there's a disproportionate increase in the funding of our level 3s relative to our level 2s and 1s. And what does this mean for students with SEND? Because again, if they're concentrating around foundation and level 2 and not at level 3, then again, disproportionate funds are going to support them, just as we're bearing the brunt of reductions in, for example, like support from local authorities. I think the other issue which has been raised in other webinars, is if we start to see an increase in the length of programs, for example, T levels, then for those learners where there are financial problems, the bursary funds and the discretionary learner support funds are going to be stretched as well. So, and that's also been occurring as we increase participation rates. We know that. But we're now getting more learners on longer programs. They're going to need more support, even if they're on placements a large amount of time. They still need the maintenance and living costs to be taken account of. So I think that there are a lot of questions that are raised by these changes, which you need to look at and consider in your own institution. But there are two fundamental questions still there. One is, I know some of you are not getting excited because your lag number effect is that in this year you might have lost 100 learners because your numbers went down last year. So 100 learners, an average of £4,000 is 400,000. And the first thing you say is, well, we've lost 400 grand through the lag number effect. We'll get 280,000 back for this, so we're still 120,000 short. So, that's just an example. So I think that's still a big issue. And I think that, because of declining numbers for some of us, I know demography is picking up now for others. Some of you are doing well on increasing your participation rates. But for some institutions, the lag number effect is still producing that negative effect. And the other issue, which all of us have got to look at, is a lot of this extra funding that we're getting, we've also been given the grant funding from the department to support with the increased cost of teacher pensions. Is that grant we know it's going to be there for this year, and we know it's going to be there for 2020-21. But after 21, it's down to whether that's still an aspect of the spending review, and is that a commitment that the government still wants to make? So a lot of this increased funding could actually be immediately used up after 2021, or as a first call on it, just simply for us to be able to meet increased teacher pension contributions. So I think those are two questions which sit outside of the way that the formula operates, but are still very important before we start saying, right, we've now got an increase in resource, we've now got an increased revenue fund for our study programs, let's start investing in smaller group sizes, teacher training, resources, etc. There are other calls on your resources before that, I think. So those are just some questions that I think are worth looking at and discussing in your own institutions. I know that once you get the toolkit, you'll get some idea of what your allocation is likely to look at. But I think this raises more fundamental questions about how the allocation is going to be divvied up. How much would you maybe have to put away for other things? How much would you have to retain as a contingency? And what's this going to do to the viability of some of your program areas, as well as obviously the rates of funding you're going to get for individual learners? So if you've got any more questions, Marek, thanks for those people that pose questions. Or if you're on the recording, obviously you might want to raise these questions. Are there any other questions? You can always contact us. And if you want to know about our membership for our subscriber service on these webinars, then please get in touch with us as quickly as possible, because we can get you set up for the next ones. In fact, the first one's this afternoon, which is on traineeships.
Yeah, if you'd like to pop along to that one, just let us know now. Drop us a line, and we'll make sure you can get access to that. So I think we've got another 5 webinars in January as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues is quite a lot of these changes will be based on the historical data that you collected in your outturn data for R14 for 18-19. The other thing to note, by the way, is that I think it's important to remind ourselves that this is catch up. So a lot of this is still trying to catch up with things that you've had to bear without an increase in funding. So there will be a period of time, I think, where you've got to sit down and say, well, actually, all this has done is brought us back to where we could have been 2 or 3 years ago. I can't see a lot of institutions through maybe a fluke of all the combinations actually ending up somewhere they should have been in real terms. I think almost all of us are in real terms, and that's why when my blog I was going on about maybe it's important still for the sector to pursue this £5,000 as a base rate. Lee, yeah, I think Marek, can we do that? Can we put an invitation out to Lee for this afternoon? Yeah, we'll make sure, Lee, that we do that. Okay. I think any more questions? We can stop the recording now.